what I would say is that intuitively, I think a lot of us know that the Logos isn't perfect because if we listen to the Logos that gets spewed out on our television screens every night in cable news hours, uh, I think a lot of us know that we're not getting the truth out of those words. And so we know better, and this is going to be reflected in what the collective unconscious does with that in our next election. And so we spread poison and paralysis around us in that we want to educate the world around us into reason. Um, so here we're educating the world, and yet what we need at home is to uh, realize that we also need our souls, and we've basically jettisoned our souls. I mean, very largely, and so now people have as as an objective having a Mercedes in the driveway or something like that. That's their God. But then they find out that that God needs to have its oil changed regularly also. Um, so, anyway, Dr. Young says, my friends, it is wise to nourish the soul, otherwise, you will breed dragons and devils in your heart. And so, um, this relates, I think, to another passage of Dr. Jaffe's book. He talks about Sabath, the Sabbath, being God's only daughter. And his point is that the physical world will consume all of our time. There's always something to do. Um, there's always leaves to blow, or a lawn to cut, or dinner to make, or whatever it is. And then we don't take time for ourselves. And so, what Dr. Jaffe's point is that we need to find time to stop the world, just stop it, and take time for ourselves and give our unconscious an opportunity to catch up, perhaps, and appreciate and understand our life and what we have, the blessings that we have. And if we don't do that, what happens is we just go off the deep end. And if we don't do that and don't have communication with our soul, then, crazy things can happen. I had a neighbor that had been a very successful businessman, but when the crash of 2008 took place, he committed suicide. And so we have to evaluate the spirits. I had similar thoughts at that time. And, but, I said to myself, okay, that was a bad spirit coming out of myself, a dark side spirit saying, oh, you're totally screwed up. You've lost all your money. Why don't you just go kill yourself? Okay, so that's the unconscious making that suggestion from the dark side. But I would always say through my ego, perish that thought. I want to see how this is going to come out. I know that the outcome is not going to be the way things are right now, and I want to see how it comes out. And so I'm not ready to get off the world. And but unfortunately, my neighbor wasn't able to think about it in that way. And we have in the United States now, we lose something like 22 young men and women a day to suicides from the U.S. military. So this is young people in the U.S. military or recently out of the military who have committed suicide. 22 a day. That's a jarring statistic, obviously. And so obviously this spirit that says this thing to people has to be recognized for a dark side spirit. And you have two streams coming out from yourself. One is light and one is dark. And this is what Dr. Jung's point is about individuation, that you're having to make decisions for the good. Um, and and if we don't learn how to do that, we're just going to have a terrible time. I had a question from my friend John, who is a local member, and I have a question coming up on Periscope, which is, why did the priest cross the road? Because he crosses everything. Okay, so it's a joke. All right, whatever. Yes, he crosses everything. Okay, so my friend John says, I just had a question that came up last night. My wife asked me what I meant by the metaphysical God. I was a little struck by such a basic question. It's what I get for bending about terms. So I went in my mind to the root, meta and physical, and determined that it means above the physical. I think, John, it also means around the physical. Meta can mean around, but yet Jung distinguishes the God image from the metaphysical God, although seemingly both of these would be above the physical, or at least having their own non-physical domain. Would you please clarify Jung's conception of the God image versus the metaphysical God? The God image is still metaphysical in the sense that it is energy captured as symbol and is therefore above the physical. So I am confused about this and need your clarity. And so I promised John in my response on email, I said I will address it, but fundamentally this is what this was Dr. Jung's sleight of hand so that he could pretend he was not poaching on the bailiwicks of the theologians. Of course he was, because everything psychological is also metaphysical, as you correctly say. The difference really came down to what Dr. Jung could show empirically versus what he couldn't. Okay, so it hit me last summer that everything psychological is metaphysical, okay, because the things that we have in our visioning and that sort of thing, there's no way to actually observe those things. We have a bunch of chemicals running around in our brains, and we have neurons that connect various parts of our brain and so on. And scientists are very far from being able to, for example, image a dream. Let's say, could we image a dream? No, we're not close. And so, as Dr. Jung said on video once, 60 years ago, we know nothing about the unconscious. We know nothing about it. And so I made the rather arrogant statement, which I now withdraw, but I'll tell you what the statement was. I made the arrogant statement that that everything psychological is metaphysical also, and Dr. Jung called it the God image and not God. And but he also said that we cannot differentiate between the God image, which is the self which he could identify empirically and discuss empirically, and the metaphysical God, the God of the theologians. And so I said, well, I'm just going to call it God because I'm not a theologian and I'm not a psychologist. And so why should I differentiate? And so that was a kind of arrogance that I took up after reading Edinger's book, The New God Image. But I'm going to withdraw that because, first of all, we don't want to break Christianity. We want Christianity to become more meaningful and for the symbols and metaphors within Christianity and within all of the religions to become meaningful to all human beings. And because they were all correct. I mean, Dr. Jung's point is that, he says this in paragraph 752 of Answer to Job, where he says, every religious statement of whatever kind is a statement of the psyche. It's not a statement of the physis, the physical world. And he says, if this weren't the case, then these statements would be in the books of natural science, which they are not. And so theologians are working in a field that's also in the psyche. But Dr. Jung's differentiation was that the items that are in the self, the God image, which is an archetype which he identified through his work with patients as a psychiatrist over 60 years, and his own psychic experiments on himself, not only presumably during the Red Book period, but later on in his life. He said he evaluated over 80,000 dreams, he thought, in his career as a psychoanalyst. And in doing that, he found lots of commonalities among people from every country. He had patients come to him from many, many different countries. And so he found certain psychic images, certain psychic facts, religious in their feel, in the psyches of many people. And so that was an empirical finding. As Dr. Edinger pointed out, and I have made available to all of you through the link that's on this video right now. I think if you look, let me just double check, but I think it is. If you look down the page where it says our subscribers are urged to watch the Edward Edinger interview at American Jungian from 1994. And then I give you two links. One is a link to the actual YouTube interview, and the other is to my transcript of that interview. And what he ultimately said was that Dr. Jung was speaking from a level of consciousness that was the source of all religions. And so, the basic point is, rather than finding how all of our religions are different and not right, we should be interacting with one another and finding out what's good about the religions of others and what they do that is useful. And one example is Dr. Jaffe talking about the Sabbath and the fact that we need to set aside a time each week, no matter what we do, to get our minds away from our troubles. And he observed that it was, among other things, a kind of death and rebirth period where at the end of the week you realize that you have failed, you've been defeated in some things, you haven't accomplished everything you wanted to get done. And so you go into a lamentation. This is a reference to the Job archetype, of course. You go into a lamentation about the fact that you can't get everything done, maybe, and then you allow a rebirth into the next week, and you come back refreshed, and so on. And if you don't find ways to refresh your soul, and whatever that is, there's no specific right answer. He says at one point here he realized that it could be leaf blowing. In other words, he says it could be leaf blowing, but does it have to be so noisy? And what he's saying is that even the guy that's blowing leaves with his noisy machine is maybe that for him is his Sabbath, because he's blocking everything else out and taking a respite. Now, for me, I sometimes in the car I'll turn it on a recording of Gregorian chant, believe it or not, because I find that very restful. But it might be something else. It could be, a symphony or something, and occasionally it's a song from the 60s or the 70s that I particularly like. And those are respites for me. Another thing is my Audible books is a respite for me. But it's a way to take yourself out of your troubles of your day-to-day life and just take time for yourself to let your psyche adjust to what's gone wrong and what's gone right in your life, and then you can come back to it. But if you just go at it all the time and don't give yourself a break, that's a lot like dental surgery, actually. It becomes like that because it's just always at you, and you don't get any rest from that. Anyway, going back to this metaphysical issue, obviously everything in the psyche is metaphysical. And what Dr. Edinger was saying in that interview was that Dr. Jung had to invent a whole new way of going at science, because in-depth psychology, you can't solve for X. I mean, there's no way that you can hold all other parameters constant and solve for this one thing, and therefore that's going to prove for you some scientific fact. And so you have to look at the situation in a holistic way, and that's the science that Dr. Jung developed, of looking at psychic facts. And one of Dr. Edinger's points is that these psychic facts are not linear. They are, he calls it, it's like fruitcake. Not crazy as fruitcake, but it's like fruitcake in that their psychic facts have lots of different aspects to them.